The first cry pierced through the silence of the Pacific Heights mansion at exactly 3:17 in the morning, cutting through the fog-shrouded California night like a knife through silk. It wasn't the ordinary wail of a hungry or uncomfortable child. This was something deeper, more desperate, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken secrets and buried pain. What made Rose's heart clench wasn't just the intensity of little Nathan's screams, but the way his tiny fingers would reach toward the sealed door at the far end of the nursery, as if he could sense something beyond that polished mahogany barrier that the rest of the world had forgotten. The door stood there like a monument to silence, its brass handle tarnished with neglect, a nameplate scratched away so thoroughly that not even a shadow of letters remained. I don't know where you're listening to this story right now. Maybe you're folding laundry in a cramped apartment, your hands moving automatically while your mind wanders to bills that need paying. Perhaps you're on the Muni bus, heading home after a long day of cleaning someone else's house, watching the city lights blur past the rain-streaked windows. Or maybe you're sitting in your own small kitchen, a cup of lukewarm coffee growing cold beside you as the weight of invisible exhaustion settles into your bones. Wherever you are, whatever brought you to this moment, I want you to know that the story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a maid and a millionaire. It's about the quiet strength that lives in the hearts of women like you, women who serve without recognition, who heal without thanks, who carry other people's pain as if it were their own. Rosa Delgado had been carrying other people's pain for as long as she could remember. At 53, her hands told the story of a life spent in service, calloused from years of scrubbing floors, scarred from countless hours over hot stoves, softened only by the gentle way she touched the faces of children who weren't her own. She lived in a narrow apartment in the Mission District, where the scent of fresh tortillas from the corner taqueria mixed with the diesel fumes from the buses that rumbled down 24th Street. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the plaster, and the radiator clanged like a ghost chain every morning at 6. But it was home, bought with money saved dollar by dollar from jobs that paid just enough to survive, never enough to truly live. Every morning, Rose's alarm would sound at 4:30, though she rarely needed it. Her body had learned to wake before the sun, trained by decades of early shifts and long commutes. She would dress quietly in the small bedroom she shared with her aging mother, pulling on the same black pants and white shirt that had become her uniform, her armor against a world that looked through her rather than at her. The journey to Pacific Heights was a pilgrimage of subway transfers and steep climbs, 90 minutes each way of watching the city transform from working-class struggle to impossible wealth. By the time she reached the towering iron gates of the Whitfield estate, the fog would be lifting from the bay, revealing glimpses of Alcatraz in the distance, like a reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold the darkest secrets. Marcus Whitfield's mansion perched on the edge of the world, like a fortress against grief. Built with old railroad money and expanded through decades of shrewd investments in tech stocks, cryptocurrency, and real estate ventures that had made him one of San Francisco's youngest billionaires, the house was a testament to the kind of wealth that could buy everything except peace. The fortune had grown beyond imagination, portfolios worth hundreds of millions, Bitcoin holdings that fluctuated like digital heartbeats, properties scattered across 3 continents like monuments to success that felt increasingly hollow. Yet, for all his assets, all his capital and investments that generated more money while he slept than most people would see in a lifetime, Marcus couldn't purchase the one thing his soul craved, redemption from the guilt that ate at him like acid. The first time Rosa saw him, he was standing at the massive windows of his home office, silhouetted against the bay view that real estate agents would call priceless. His shoulders carried the weight of loss in their rigid line, and his eyes held the particular emptiness that comes from having everything and feeling nothing. At 42, he should have been in his prime, enjoying the fruits of his financial empire. Instead, he moved through his mansion like a ghost haunting his own life, surrounded by luxury that mocked his inner poverty. The staff whispered that he hadn't smiled properly since his wife disappeared 2 years ago, leaving behind only questions that no amount of money could answer. Casa Whitfield, as the house staff called it behind closed doors, was less a home than a museum of abandoned dreams. Marble floors stretched like frozen lakes between rooms that echoed with emptiness, and crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light on furniture that no one sat in, art that no one admired. The kitchen, large enough to serve a restaurant, prepared meals that were eaten in silence or not at all. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could maintain, but love had long since fled. The investment in this show of wealth, millions poured into renovations, antiques, and artwork, felt like trying to fill an ocean with tears. When Rosa first walked through those imposing front doors, carrying her small bag of cleaning supplies and the hope that this job might finally provide the steady income her family needed, she felt the cold immediately. Not the kind of cold that comes from San Francisco's famous fog, but something deeper, the chill of a house where love had frozen over. The other staff members regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, reserved for newcomers who didn't understand yet what this place could do to a person's spirit. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper who had worked for the Whitfields for 15 years, looked Rosa up and down with eyes that had seen too many maids come and go. "You'll be responsible for the third floor," Mrs. Patterson announced in a voice that could cut glass. "The master bedroom, the nursery, and the guest suites. Just remember, there are rules in this house that aren't written down, and the most important one is that some doors stay closed for a reason." Rosa's assignment included caring for little Nathan, Mr. Whitfield's 2-year-old son, a beautiful child with dark hair and eyes that seemed far too old for his small face. The baby had been born just months before his mother's mysterious disappearance, and since then, he had been raised by a succession of nannies who never stayed long enough to form real attachments. The nursery where Nathan spent most of his time was elegant and expensive. Hand-painted murals of fairy tale forests covered the walls, and his crib was crafted from wood that cost more than Rosa's annual rent. Yet despite all this luxury, the room felt empty, as if the love that should have filled it had been sucked out through the keyhole of that sealed door. The door stood at the far end of the nursery, like a guardian of secrets. According to the whispered conversations Rosa overheard between the other staff members, it had once led to what was meant to be a mother's sitting room, a place where Mrs. Whitfield would have nursed her baby, read him stories, sung him to sleep. But the room had been sealed shortly after her disappearance, locked away like a tomb for the living. The brass nameplate that had once announced Elena's room had been scraped away so violently that scratches scarred the wood, as if someone had tried to erase not just the name but the memory it represented. Every night, without fail, Nathan would wake screaming, not the ordinary cries of a restless toddler, but anguished wails that seemed to echo through the mansion's halls like a morning song. Rosa would find him standing in his crib, tiny hands gripping the rails, his eyes fixed on that sealed door with an intensity that broke her heart. He would reach toward it, his small fingers stretching as if he could somehow touch whatever lay beyond, and the desperation in his movements spoke of a loss that no child should have to carry. The other staff members had grown immune to Nathan's nightly distress, closing their doors and turning up their televisions to drown out the sound. But Rosa couldn't ignore it. Each cry felt like a hook in her chest, pulling her from whatever task she was completing to rush to the nursery. She would lift the little boy into her arms, feeling his small body tremble with the force of emotions he wasn't old enough to understand, let alone express. His tears would soak through her shirt as she rocked him, humming the same lullabies her grandmother had sung to her in their tiny apartment in Guadalajara so many years ago. "Duérmete, mi niño," she would whisper, her voice barely audible over his sobs. "Sleep, little one. The morning will bring new hope." But even as she spoke the words, Rosa wondered if hope was something this house had forgotten how to hold. During those long nights, as she walked the nursery floor with Nathan in her arms, Rosa began to notice patterns in his distress. His cries would intensify whenever the wind came off the bay, howling around the corners of the mansion like lost souls seeking shelter. He would tap against her shoulder with his tiny fists in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, a Morse code of grief that only he understood. And always, always, his eyes would return to that sealed door, as if he could see through the wood to whatever truth lay hidden beyond. The contrast between worlds had never been more apparent to Rosa than in those midnight hours. Here she was, a woman who had spent her life accumulating nothing but dignity and strength, holding a child who had been born into wealth beyond imagination, yet possessed nothing of what really mattered. Nathan's trust fund alone contained more money than her entire neighborhood would see in a generation, investments in blue-chip stocks, bonds, cryptocurrency portfolios that fluctuated by thousands of dollars while she earned minimum wage. The irony wasn't lost on her that this little boy, surrounded by luxury that most people could only dream of, was poorer in the ways that counted than any child she had ever known. Marcus Whitfield was a stranger in his own home, moving through the halls like a man underwater, distant and unreachable. Rosa would catch glimpses of him at odd hours, standing at the kitchen counter at 3 a.m, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, or sitting in his study surrounded by financial reports that documented his empire's continued growth while his personal world crumbled. His wealth continued to multiply even in his grief, stock dividends arriving monthly, cryptocurrency gains that added zeros to accounts he barely remembered he owned, rental income from properties scattered across the globe. But all the money in the world couldn't fill the Nathan-shaped hole that his neglect had carved in his son's heart. Rosa's own story was written in the lines around her eyes and the strength in her weathered hands. She had come to the United States 25 years ago with nothing but hope and a willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible. Her first job had been cleaning office buildings downtown, working nights so she could attend English classes during the day. She had scrubbed floors in tech companies whose stock options would have made her rich if she'd been born into a different world, emptied trash cans filled with the remnants of business deals worth millions, wiped down conference room tables where venture capitalists decided the fate of startups with casual signatures. Over the years, she had worked for families across the city's wealthiest neighborhoods, witnessing up close how money could transform people, sometimes for the better, often for the worse. She had cleaned mansions where more was spent on a single dinner party than she earned in a year, had organized closets filled with designer clothes that cost more than her car, had prepared guest bedrooms for visitors who would never know the luxury they were surrounded by because they had never known anything else. But through it all, Rosa had maintained something that no amount of wealth could buy and no depth of poverty could take away: her humanity. She had learned to see past the marble countertops and designer furniture to the human stories underneath. The lonely executives who worked 18-hour days building empires they would never have time to enjoy. The society wives who filled their calendars with charity galas and shopping trips to avoid confronting the emptiness in their marriages. The children who grew up in mansions but starved for the kind of love that couldn't be purchased with trust funds and private school tuitions. Nathan represented the culmination of everything Rosa had witnessed in her years of service. Here was a child born into more privilege than entire generations of her own family had ever known. Yet, he was emotionally abandoned in ways that no amount of money could fix. His nursery contained toys that cost more than Rosa's monthly rent, educational materials recommended by child development experts who charged hundreds of dollars per consultation, a crib that had been handcrafted by artisans in Italy. But what Nathan needed most, the loving presence of a parent who saw him as more than just an extension of their own pain, was the one thing his father's billions couldn't provide. Rosa's presence in the nursery began to work a quiet magic that had nothing to do with her cleaning skills and everything to do with her capacity for love. She would arrive each morning to find Nathan sitting in his crib, no longer crying but waiting, as if he had learned to anticipate the comfort her arrival would bring. His eyes would brighten when she entered the room, and his small arms would reach for her with a trust that broke her heart and mended it simultaneously. She began to bring small things from her own world into his sterile environment. A wooden maraca that her nephew had outgrown, painted bright red and yellow with folk art designs that seemed to pulse with life against the nursery's muted palette. A book of children's songs in Spanish that she would read to him in the afternoons, her voice rising and falling with the familiar rhythms of her childhood. Most significantly, she brought herself, her patience, her gentleness, her ability to be fully present with a child who had been surrounded by caregivers who were physically there but emotionally absent. Under Rosa's care, Nathan began to change. His nightly screaming fits became less frequent, then less intense, until they evolved into quiet whimpers that she could soothe with a few minutes of gentle rocking. He started to sleep through the night, his small body finally able to rest without the anxiety that had kept him in a state of constant distress. During the day, he would follow Rosa around the nursery with his eyes, babbling in the mixture of sounds and almost words that preceded real speech, as if he were trying to tell her stories in a language only the two of them understood. But it was more than just Nathan who began to transform under Rosa's influence. The nursery itself seemed to come alive in ways that had nothing to do with the expensive renovations and everything to do with the love that was finally being poured into its spaces. The plants that had been slowly dying in their decorator-chosen pots suddenly began to flourish, their leaves growing greener and reaching toward the windows with renewed vitality. The afternoon light that streamed through those windows seemed warmer somehow, as if the sun itself was responding to the change in the room's emotional temperature. Rosa had a gift for seeing the potential for beauty in the most broken places, and she applied this gift to every corner of Nathan's world. She rearranged the furniture not according to any design principle, but according to what felt most nurturing, moving the rocking chair closer to the windows so Nathan could watch the boats on the bay while she sang to him, relocating his toy box so that his blocks and stuffed animals created a small, intimate play area where the two of them could build towers and knock them down with the kind of gleeful destruction that healthy toddlers needed. The changes Rosa brought to the nursery began to ripple outward through the house like stones dropped in still water. Other staff members noticed that the third floor felt different when they passed through it, warmer somehow, less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people actually lived. Mrs. Patterson, who had initially viewed Rosa with the suspicion she reserved for all new employees, began to soften around the edges, occasionally asking how Nathan was doing with a genuine interest that surprised them both. Even Marcus Whitfield, wrapped as he was in his cocoon of grief and guilt, could not remain entirely immune to the transformation occurring under his own roof. He would sometimes pause outside the nursery door during his restless midnight wanderings, listening to the sound of Rosa's voice as she soothed his son back to sleep. For the first time in 2 years, the silence in his house was being broken by something other than his own tortured thoughts. But as Rosa had learned through decades of working in other people's homes, change, especially the kind that threatens established patterns of pain, rarely comes without resistance. The house that had been frozen in grief for so long began to push back against her warming presence like an immune system rejecting medicine. And the resistance would come from the most unexpected places, threatening to destroy not just Rosa's job, but the fragile healing that had finally begun to take root in the heart of a broken family. The first sign of trouble came from an unlikely source, Nathan himself. As the little boy grew more attached to Rosa, he became increasingly agitated whenever she was not in the room. His contentment during the hours she spent with him was balanced by a new kind of distress when she had to leave to attend to her other duties. He would toddle after her when she moved to clean other rooms, his small legs working furiously to keep up with her longer strides, crying pitifully when she had to close doors behind her to vacuum or dust spaces that weren't safe for a curious toddler. Mrs. Patterson noted this development with the kind of sharp-eyed disapproval that Rosa had learned to recognize in supervisors who saw emotional attachments between staff and family members as dangerous territory. That child is becoming too dependent on you, she warned Rosa one afternoon, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen maids fired for less. Mr. Whitfield doesn't like disruptions to his routine, and a crying child following the help around the house definitely counts as a disruption. What Mrs. Patterson didn't say, but what Rosa could read clearly in the older woman's expression, was that there were unspoken rules about the kinds of relationships staff members were allowed to form with the families they served. Care, yes, that was expected, even demanded. But love? The kind of genuine emotional connection that was growing between Rosa and Nathan? That was the kind of territory that made wealthy employers nervous, threatening the carefully maintained distance between the served and those who served them. Rosa tried to find a balance, but Nathan made it increasingly difficult. During the evenings when her official duties were finished and she was free to return to her own small apartment in the Mission, the little boy would stand at the window of his nursery, pressing his face against the glass as he watched her walk down the long driveway to the bus stop. His cries would echo across the grounds, audible even through the mansion's thick walls, a sound that followed Rosa onto the bus and into her dreams. The other staff members began to treat Rosa with a mixture of envy and concern. Some, like Maria, who worked in the kitchen, admired her ability to connect with the Whitfield child in ways that previous nannies had failed to achieve. "You have a gift," Maria would tell her in Spanish during their brief encounters in the service hallways. But gifts can be dangerous things in houses like this. Others, particularly those who had been with the family longer, viewed Rosa's success with Nathan as a threat to the established order, a disruption of the carefully maintained emotional distance that allowed them to do their jobs without getting personally involved in the tragedies that wealth could not prevent. Central to all of this tension was the sealed door that dominated one end of the nursery. As Nathan's attachment to Rosa grew stronger, so did his fascination with whatever lay beyond that mysterious barrier. He would point to it during their play sessions, babbling questions that his limited vocabulary could not fully express. When Rosa sang to him, he would sometimes stop listening and turn his attention to the door, as if he could hear other voices calling to him from the locked room beyond. Rosa found herself increasingly curious about what the door might conceal. During her quiet moments while Nathan napped, she would study its surface, noting the way the scratched-out nameplate caught the light, the fingerprints around the handle that suggested desperate attempts to open it. The lock itself was substantial, not the kind of simple privacy lock found on most interior doors, but a heavy deadbolt that spoke of someone's determination to keep the room sealed permanently. The mystery deepened when Rosa began to notice that she was not the only one drawn to the door. Late at night, when the house settled into its uncomfortable quiet, she would sometimes hear footsteps in the hallway outside the nursery, slow, hesitant steps that would pause just outside the sealed room. The footsteps never tried to enter, never rattled the handle or tested the lock, but their presence suggested that whatever secrets lay beyond the door continued to call to someone else in the house. It was during one of these mysterious midnight visitations that Rosa finally encountered Marcus Whitfield face to face. She had been sitting in the rocking chair with Nathan, who had woken from a nightmare and was taking his time settling back to sleep when she heard the familiar footsteps in the hall. This time, instead of passing by, they stopped directly outside the nursery door. Rosa held her breath, Nathan sleeping peacefully in her arms as the door handle slowly turned. Marcus stepped into the room like a man entering a church, quietly, reverently, with the weight of unspoken prayers on his shoulders. In the dim light from the sailboat nightlight, Rosa could see that he was still dressed in the expensive business suit he had worn during the day, though his tie was loosened and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. His eyes were red-rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical fatigue, but from carrying emotional burdens too heavy for one person to bear. For a moment, father and son were together in the same space for the first time in Rosa's memory, separated by more than just the distance between the door and the rocking chair. Marcus stared at Nathan with an expression that mixed love and pain in equal measure, as if the sight of his son sleeping peacefully was both the most beautiful and most torturous thing he could imagine. "He looks like her when he sleeps," Marcus whispered, his voice so quiet that Rosa had to strain to hear it. The words hung in the air between them, the first personal thing he had ever said in her presence, a confession that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Rosa held very still, afraid that any movement might break the spell and send Marcus retreating back to whatever emotional fortress he had built around himself. But instead of leaving, he moved further into the room, his expensive leather shoes silent on the plush carpeting. He stopped a few feet from the rocking chair, close enough that Rosa could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that probably cost more than she earned in a month. "You're Rosa," he said. And it wasn't a question. His voice carried none of the imperious tone she might have expected from a man of his wealth and position, no hint of the emotional distance that usually separated employers from their domestic staff. Instead, there was something almost vulnerable in the way he spoke her name, as if he was testing its weight on his tongue. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield," she replied softly, careful not to wake Nathan, who had finally settled into the deep sleep of a contented child. Marcus studied his son's peaceful face for a long moment before raising his eyes to meet Rosa's. In the dim light, she could see that his were filled with a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "He stopped crying at night," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if Nathan's newfound ability to sleep through the night was a miracle he hadn't dared to hope for. "Children need to feel safe before they can rest," Rosa responded carefully, not sure how much truth this man was prepared to handle. Something flickered across Marcus's face at her words, recognition, perhaps, or guilt. He looked away from her and toward the sealed door at the far end of the nursery, and Rosa saw his jaw clench with the effort of keeping his emotions contained. "That door," he said, though he didn't finish the sentence. The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning that Rosa could sense but not fully comprehend. "He looks at it sometimes," Rosa said gently, offering the observation as a gift he could either accept or reject. Marcus nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "She used to sit in there," he said finally, his voice so low that Rosa had to lean forward to catch the words. "When she was pregnant with Nathan, she would read to him, play music, talk about all the adventures they would have together. She called it her dreaming room." The past tense hung between them like a ghost. Rosa waited, sensing that Marcus needed to say more but was struggling to find the words. Outside the windows, the fog was rolling in from the bay, and the distant sound of foghorns added their mournful voices to the night's conversation. "After she disappeared, I locked it up," Marcus continued, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I couldn't stand to look at the rocking chair where she used to sit, the books she had bought for a son she would never see grow up, the mobile she had chosen to hang over his crib. It felt like keeping a tomb in my house, but somehow locking it away was worse. It made everything feel more damaged." Rosa understood then that the sealed door was not just about preserving memory, but about containing pain that had become too large for one person to carry. She looked down at Nathan, sleeping so peacefully in her arms, and wondered how many nights he had reached toward that door, somehow sensing that part of his story was locked away behind its wooden barrier. "Sometimes," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly, "I think he knows she's supposed to be there, not in the room, but here, present. And maybe he cries because he feels her absence in ways I'm too broken to help him understand." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and immediate. Rosa felt her heart clench with empathy for this man who had everything money could buy, but was starving for the one thing his wealth could not provide: absolution from the guilt of surviving when someone he loved had not. "Mr. Whitfield," Rosa said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "children feel what we feel. If you are carrying pain, he will carry it too, even if he doesn't understand why." Marcus looked at her sharply, as if her words had struck something deep inside him. For a moment, Rosa was afraid she had overstepped the invisible boundaries that separated employers from their help, had presumed to offer wisdom where only service was expected. But instead of anger, she saw recognition in his eyes. "You're right," he said simply. "I've been so afraid of facing my own grief that I never considered how it might be affecting him." They stood together in the soft darkness of the nursery, two people from completely different worlds, united by their concern for the sleeping child in Rosa's arms. The contrast between them could not have been more stark. Marcus in his expensive suit that cost more than Rosa's monthly rent. She in her simple uniform that had been washed so many times the fabric was thin in places. His hands soft from a life of privilege, hers calloused from decades of labor. His world measured in stock portfolios and real estate investments, hers in bus transfers and grocery store coupons. Yet, in that moment, none of those differences mattered. They were simply two adults who cared about Nathan's healing, drawn together by the kind of love that transcends economic boundaries. "Would you," Marcus began, then stopped himself, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to ask whatever it was he wanted to request. "Yes?" Rosa prompted gently. "Would you teach me," he said, the words coming out in a rush, "how to comfort him when he cries, how to make him feel safe the way you do? I've been paying other people to take care of him because I told myself I was too busy, too grief-stricken, too broken to be the father he needs. But watching him sleep now, seeing how peaceful he is with you, I realize I've been running away from the most important job I'll ever have." Rosa felt tears prick her eyes at the vulnerability in his voice. This man who commanded boardrooms and managed investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars was asking a maid from the Mission District to teach him how to love his own son. The humility in his request spoke to a transformation that she sensed had been building beneath the surface of his grief, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "It's not about perfect technique," Rosa said softly. "It's about being present, really present. Children don't need expensive toys or perfect rooms. They need to feel that someone sees them, knows them, loves them exactly as they are." Marcus nodded as if he was memorizing her words. "I want to try," he said. "I want to be better than I've been." It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but genuine. As Marcus carefully took his son from Rosa's arms, his movements awkward but tender, she saw the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Nathan stirred slightly in the transition, but didn't wake, already trusting enough to remain peaceful even as he moved from familiar arms to ones that were still learning how to hold him. Rosa slipped quietly from the nursery, leaving father and son alone together for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion. As she made her way down the service stairs to the small staff quarters where she spent her nights, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope that the work she was doing might actually matter, that her presence in this house might contribute to healing rather than just maintenance. She had no way of knowing that her small victory would soon become the foundation for a battle that would test not just her job security, but her faith in justice itself. The morning brought fog so thick that Rosa could barely see the bus stop from her apartment window. The weather seemed to mirror the growing tension she had sensed building in the Whitfield mansion over the past few weeks, a heaviness that had nothing to do with San Francisco's famous marine layer and everything to do with the way change, even positive change, could threaten people who had grown comfortable with dysfunction. As Rosa navigated the familiar maze of bus transfers that carried her from the Mission District to Pacific Heights, she replayed her conversation with Marcus from the previous night. The vulnerability he had shown, the genuine desire to connect with his son, had revealed a side of him that she had never suspected existed beneath his fortress of wealth and grief. But she also knew from experience that powerful people often retreated from emotional breakthroughs once the daylight exposed them to the judgment of others. When Rosa arrived at the mansion, she immediately sensed that something had shifted in the household's delicate ecosystem. Mrs. Patterson greeted her at the staff entrance with the expression that mixed disapproval with something that looked almost like pity. The older woman's lips were pressed into the thin line that Rosa had learned to recognize as a sign of impending trouble. "Mr. Whitfield wants to see you in his office," Mrs. Patterson announced without preamble, "before you start your regular duties." Rosa felt her stomach drop. In her years of domestic work, she had learned that early morning summons to the employer's office rarely brought good news. She followed Mrs. Patterson through the service corridors that connected the house like arteries, her mind racing through possible explanations for the request. Had someone complained about her interaction with Marcus the previous night? Had she somehow overstepped boundaries she didn't even know existed? Marcus's office was a monument to success that felt more like a mausoleum of ambition. The walls were lined with awards and photographs, documenting his rise from privileged student to tech entrepreneur to venture capitalist managing funds worth billions. Stock certificates from his early investments were displayed in expensive frames, their values having multiplied thousands of times over since their purchase. A digital ticker scrolled across one wall, displaying real-time updates of market indices, cryptocurrency prices, and the performance metrics of the various companies in his portfolio. But for all its displays of financial triumph, the office felt empty in the same way that the rest of the house did. Impressive but unlived in, successful but soulless. Marcus sat behind a desk that could have served as a landing pad for small aircraft, wearing another of his perfect suits, his composed businessman facade firmly back in place. The vulnerable father, who had asked Rosa to teach him how to comfort his son, seemed like a figment of her imagination. "Rosa," he said as she entered, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down." She perched on the edge of the chair, maintaining the respectful posture she had perfected over years of similar conversations with employers. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back straight, her expression neutral. She had learned to make herself small in these moments, to present as little target as possible for whatever criticism or dismissal might be coming. "I wanted to discuss last night," Marcus began, though he didn't meet her eyes as he spoke. Instead, he focused on the financial reports scattered across his desk, documents that detailed investment returns and asset allocations with the kind of precision that his emotional life lacked. "I may have given you the wrong impression about the nature of your employment here." Rosa felt her heart sink, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had been through this before, the moment when an employer realized they had revealed too much of themselves to someone they paid to clean their toilets and wash their dishes. The retreat was predictable, even if it was painful to witness. "I understand, Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully. "I didn't mean to overstep any boundaries." "It's not about boundaries," Marcus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's about maintaining appropriate professional relationships. My son needs consistency and structure, not emotional attachments that could be disrupted if employment circumstances change." The words hit Rosa like cold water. She understood their subtext perfectly. Nathan was becoming too attached to her, and Marcus had decided that was dangerous territory. Better to maintain emotional distance than risk the complications that genuine human connection might bring. "Of course," Rosa replied, though each word felt like swallowing broken glass. "I'll be more careful about maintaining appropriate distance." But even as she spoke the words, Rosa knew they were both lying. Nathan's need for love and attachment wasn't something that could be regulated by employment policies, and Marcus's own hunger for connection with his son couldn't be satisfied by maintaining professional distance. They were trying to solve emotional problems with business solutions, and Rosa had lived long enough to know that such approaches never worked. Marcus seemed to realize this too, because his composure wavered for a moment, his hands clenched and unclenched on his desk, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. The businessman who valued control and predictability was at war with the father who had finally glimpsed what his son needed to heal. "I don't want to hurt him," Marcus said suddenly, his professional facade cracking. "Nathan, I mean, but I also I can't let myself hope for things that might not last." Rosa understood then that Marcus's retreat had less to do with her potential overreach and more to do with his own terror of vulnerability. He was protecting himself from the possibility of loss by refusing to allow genuine connections to form. It was the same instinct that had led him to seal his wife's room rather than process his grief, to hire a succession of interchangeable nannies rather than risk caring about any of them. "Mr. Whitfield," Rosa said gently, "healing always involves risk. There's no way to love someone without accepting that loss is possible." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than their simple construction should have been able to bear. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Rosa saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. "I'm not ready," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him more than any financial investment he had ever made. "No one ever feels ready," Rosa replied, "but children can't wait for us to overcome our fears. They grow up whether we're present for it or not." She stood up from the leather chair, smoothing her uniform skirt with hands that remained steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. She had said what needed to be said, offered what wisdom she could. The rest was up to Marcus. "I should check on Nathan," she said. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned he had a difficult night." Marcus nodded, though he didn't look up from his desk. "We'll continue this conversation later," he said, falling back on the kind of corporate speak that allowed him to avoid making any actual commitments. Rosa left the office understanding that she was walking a tightrope that could snap at any moment. On one side lay Nathan's healing and Marcus's potential redemption. On the other, the practical reality that she needed this job to support her family and couldn't afford to push too hard against the boundaries her employer was trying to establish. When she reached the nursery, she found Nathan standing in his crib, tears streaming down his small face. His distress was different from the desperate screaming that had characterized his nights before Rosa's arrival. This was the quiet crying of a child who had learned not to expect comfort, who had already begun to surrender hope that anyone would come. Rosa's heart broke as she lifted him from the crib, feeling the way his small body immediately melted into her embrace. He buried his face against her shoulder, his tears soaking through her uniform, and she knew that whatever professional distance Marcus wanted her to maintain was already impossible. This child had claimed a piece of her heart, and she could no more withdraw her love from him than she could stop breathing. "It's okay, mijo," she whispered against his hair, using the Spanish endearment that her own mother had used with her children. "I'm here. You're safe." But even as she comforted Nathan, Rosa wondered how long she would be allowed to keep that promise. The dynamics in the house were shifting in ways that felt dangerous, and she could sense that forces beyond her control were aligning against the fragile progress that had been made. The first indication of real trouble came that afternoon, when Rosa was organizing Nathan's toys while he napped. She had developed a system for rotating his playthings that kept him engaged without overwhelming his developing mind with too many choices. It was the kind of thoughtful attention to detail that came naturally to her, refined through years of caring for other families' children. She was kneeling beside his toy box, sorting blocks into containers by color and size, when she heard voices in the hallway outside the nursery. The conversation was hushed but intense, and Rosa recognized Mrs. Patterson's disapproving tone immediately. "It's becoming inappropriate," the head housekeeper was saying to someone Rosa couldn't identify. "The lady is overstepping her role, getting too involved with the child's emotional needs. Mr. Whitfield specifically requested that we maintain professional boundaries, but she's treating the boy like he belongs to her." "The child seems happier," replied a voice that Rosa now recognized as belonging to Dr. Martin, Nathan's pediatrician. "His development has improved markedly since the new caregiver arrived. Sometimes what looks like overstepping is actually exactly what a traumatized child needs." "That's not the point," Mrs. Patterson responded sharply. "We've had problems before with help who forgot their place. It never ends well for the family or the employee. Better to address these issues before they become larger problems." Rosa felt ice forming in her veins as she realized she was the subject of their conversation. Her success with Nathan, rather than being celebrated, was being viewed as a threat to the established order. The very qualities that made her good at her job, her empathy, her willingness to form genuine connections, her ability to see Nathan as a whole person rather than just another task to complete, were being reframed as professional failures. She remained frozen in her kneeling position beside the toy box, afraid that any movement might alert the speakers to her presence and make an already difficult situation worse. But she couldn't help noticing the irony of the moment. She was literally on her knees when she learned that her kindness toward a motherless child was being interpreted as a threat. "I understand your concerns," Dr. Martin was saying, "but I would encourage you to consider the child's well-being above administrative convenience. This boy has experienced significant trauma and abandonment. If he has finally found someone he trusts, disrupting that relationship could set his development back months or even years." "That's exactly why these attachments are dangerous," Mrs. Patterson replied. "What happens when she leaves, or when Mr. Whitfield decides her services are no longer needed? We'll be left with an even more damaged child and a mess that someone else will have to clean up." The conversation continued, but Rosa had heard enough. She understood now that her position in the house was more precarious than she had realized, balanced on the competing demands of Nathan's emotional needs and the household staff's desire for predictability. Her love for the little boy, the very thing that made her effective at caring for him, was being weaponized against her by people who saw emotional connections as complications to be managed rather than healing forces to be nurtured. When the voices finally faded down the hallway, Rosa remained kneeling beside the toy box, her hands still sorting blocks automatically while her mind raced through the implications of what she had heard. She thought of her mother, dependent on Rosa's income for her medications. She thought of her sister Maria, still studying to become a nurse and counting on Rosa's financial support to make ends meet. She thought of her own small savings account, built dollar by dollar from jobs like this one. Never quite enough to provide the security that would allow her to speak her mind without fear of economic consequences. But then she looked over at Nathan, sleeping peacefully in his crib, his small face relaxed in a way that had been impossible before her arrival. His trust in her was complete and absolute, the kind of faith that children could only extend to people who had proven themselves worthy of it. How could she withdraw that love to protect herself, knowing that doing so would damage him in ways that might never heal? Rosa finished organizing the toys and stood up slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling on the hardwood floor for so long. She took a long look at Nathan's sleeping form, memorizing the peaceful expression on his small face, storing the image against whatever difficulties might lie ahead. She had been in impossible situations before, caught between her own needs for survival and her instinct to nurture and protect. Now, as she had learned to do so many times in the past, she would find a way to navigate the narrow path between self-preservation and service to others. But she would not sacrifice this child's healing on the altar of other people's comfort with emotional distance. Whatever was coming, she would meet it with the dignity and strength that had carried her through 53 years of life, in a world that often seemed designed to break people like her. Nathan deserved that much, and Rosa had built her life on the principle that children's needs came first, even when advocating for them carried personal costs. The sealed door at the far end of the nursery seemed to watch her as she made this internal commitment, its scratched nameplate catching the afternoon light like a reminder that some truths were worth protecting, no matter how much pressure others applied to keep them hidden. Rosa had a feeling that the conflict brewing in the Whitfield household would soon force everyone involved to confront the secrets they had spent so long trying to avoid. And she would be ready. Late October brought rain to San Francisco that seemed to weep for all the city's hidden sorrows. Rosa watched the drops cascade down the tall windows of the nursery, while Nathan played at her feet, building towers with his wooden blocks, only to knock them down with the gleeful destructiveness that marked healthy toddler development. The sound of his laughter was like sunlight breaking through the gray afternoon. A reminder that joy could exist even in houses built on foundations of unprocessed grief. But beneath Nathan's contentment, Rosa sensed a growing tension in the mansion's atmosphere. Staff members whispered in corners and fell silent when she approached. Mrs. Patterson's disapproval had crystallized into something sharper and more focused, like ice forming around a stone. Even the household routines felt different, more rigid, more watched, as if someone was documenting every interaction for future judgment. The change became impossible to ignore when Rosa arrived at work one morning to find a woman she didn't recognize sitting in Marcus's office. Through the partially open door, she could see someone in an expensive navy suit taking notes, while Marcus spoke in the low, controlled tones he used for serious business discussions. The woman's hair was pulled back in the kind of severe bun that suggested authority, and her briefcase bore the embossed logo of what Rosa assumed was a high-end consulting firm. "That's the efficiency expert," Maria whispered when Rosa stopped by the kitchen for Nathan's morning bottle. The cook had been at the Whitfield house for nearly a decade, long enough to recognize the signs of impending change. Mr. Whitfield hired her to evaluate the household operations and make recommendations for improvement. Rosa felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. She had worked for enough wealthy families to know that efficiency experts were rarely brought in to celebrate what was working well. More often, they arrived to provide professional cover for decisions that employers wanted to make but lacked the courage to implement directly. "What kind of improvements?" Rosa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Maria glanced around the kitchen to ensure they were alone before responding. "Reducing redundancies in staffing, streamlining emotional attachments that might compromise professional objectivity, making sure everyone understands their appropriate role and stays within those boundaries." The euphemisms were carefully chosen, but their meaning was clear enough. Someone, probably Mrs. Patterson, possibly Marcus himself, had decided that Rosa's relationship with Nathan represented a problem that needed to be solved through corporate intervention. "How long has she been here?" Rosa asked, trying to keep her voice level despite the fear rising in her chest. 3 days, Maria replied. "She's been interviewing staff members, observing daily routines, taking photographs of the work areas. She spent an hour yesterday watching you through the nursery doorway while you were singing to Nathan during his nap." The idea that her most tender moments with the little boy were being analyzed for efficiency made Rosa feel physically sick. She imagined the consultant reducing Nathan's need for comfort to a line item on a spreadsheet, quantifying the time Rosa spent rocking him to sleep as if love could be measured in billable hours. "What will you do?" Maria asked, her eyes soft with sympathy for Rosa's impossible situation. "My job," Rosa replied simply. "The same thing I've always done." But as she made her way to the nursery, Rosa wondered if doing her job properly was what had gotten her into trouble in the first place. She'd been hired to clean and organize Nathan's physical environment, not to heal his emotional wounds. The fact that she excelled at both aspects of care apparently made some people nervous about where her true loyalties lay. Nathan greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, arms reaching toward her the moment she entered the room. His face lit up with the kind of pure joy that children reserved for the people who made them feel completely safe in an uncertain world. As Rosa lifted him from his crib, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and innocence that clung to his hair, she wondered how anyone could view this connection as anything other than miraculous. "Good morning, mi amor," she whispered against his forehead, using the Spanish endearments that came as naturally to her as breathing. "Did you sleep well?" Nathan babbled his response in the mixture of sounds and almost words that suggested he was on the verge of making the leap into real language. Rosa had been documenting his developmental progress in her own mind, celebrating each small milestone as if he were her own child. His vocabulary was expanding, his motor skills improving, his capacity for sustained attention growing stronger each week. By any objective measure, he was thriving under her care. But as the morning progressed, Rosa became acutely aware of being watched. The efficiency expert, whose name she learned was Mrs. Cromwell, appeared in the nursery doorway at regular intervals, clipboard in hand, observing Nathan's interactions with Rosa like a scientist studying lab specimens. Her presence changed the atmosphere in the room, making even routine activities feel staged and artificial. During Nathan's morning snack, Mrs. Cromwell approached Rosa directly for the first time. "I'm Patricia Cromwell," she announced, extending a hand that felt cool and impersonal when Rosa shook it. "I'm conducting a comprehensive review of household operations for Mr. Whitfield. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your responsibilities here." Rosa nodded, settling Nathan in his high chair with a few pieces of soft fruit while trying to keep her expression neutral. She had learned through hard experience that cooperating fully with authority figures was usually the safest approach, even when their intentions seemed hostile. "How long have you been employed by the Whitfield family?" Mrs. Cromwell asked, pen poised over her clipboard. "8 months," Rosa replied, wiping Nathan's hands with a small towel as he explored the texture of a banana slice with his fingers. "And your primary responsibilities involve child care and light housekeeping on the 3rd floor?" "Yes, that's correct." Mrs. Cromwell made a note before continuing. "I've observed that you spend considerable time engaged in activities that might be considered outside the scope of typical domestic duties. Singing, storytelling, extended physical comfort beyond basic needs. How do you justify allocating time to these activities?" The question was phrased in the language of corporate efficiency, but Rosa heard its true meaning. Why did she insist on treating Nathan like a human being rather than a task to be completed? How did she justify showing love to a child who had been abandoned by the one person who should love him most? "Nathan's emotional development is connected to his physical well-being," Rosa answered carefully. "A child who feels secure and loved is more likely to eat well, sleep well, and reach developmental milestones. The activities you mentioned support his overall health." It was a diplomatically crafted response that attempted to translate love into the language of measurable outcomes. But even as Rosa spoke the words, she felt diminished by having to justify her relationship with Nathan in terms of efficiency rather than humanity. Mrs. Cromwell made more notes. "And how would you characterize your relationship with the child? Professional distance, appropriate attachment, or something more intensive?" The trap in the question was obvious. If Rosa claimed professional distance, she would be lying, and Mrs. Cromwell had clearly observed enough to know the truth. If she admitted to deeper attachment, she would be providing evidence that could be used to justify her dismissal. "I care about Nathan's well-being," Rosa said finally. "I believe that children benefit from consistent, nurturing relationships with their caregivers, even when those relationships might interfere with the child's primary attachment to his father." The question hit Rosa like a physical blow. The implication was clear. Her love for Nathan was being framed as competition with Marcus rather than support for his parenting. Her success at providing the emotional stability that Nathan needed was being recast as harmful interference with the father-son relationship that everyone agreed needed strengthening. Before Rosa could formulate a response, Nathan began to fuss in his high chair, reaching toward her with the insistent gestures of a child who wanted to be held. Without thinking, Rosa moved to lift him out of the chair, but Mrs. Cromwell's sharp voice stopped her. "Leave him," the consultant commanded. "This is exactly the kind of immediate response to minor distress that creates unhealthy dependency." Rosa felt her heart clench as Nathan's fussing escalated to frustrated crying. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to comfort him, but Mrs. Cromwell was watching with the attention of a hawk, clearly testing Rosa's willingness to follow instructions that contradicted her natural impulses. "He's not in any danger," Mrs. Cromwell continued, making notes as Nathan's cries grew more desperate. "Children need to learn self-soothing skills. Responding to every expression of minor discomfort teaches them that emotional regulation is someone else's responsibility." The words were probably true in some theoretical sense, Rosa knew. Child development experts did advocate for allowing children to experience manageable frustration as part of learning emotional resilience. But watching Nathan reach toward her while she remained frozen in artificial distance felt like a betrayal of everything he had come to trust about their relationship. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Mrs. Cromwell nodded toward Nathan. "Now you may comfort him," she said, as if granting permission for Rosa to express the love that had been straining against her ribs like a caged bird. Rosa lifted Nathan immediately, feeling his small body relax into her familiar embrace. His tears had left tracks down his cheeks that she gently wiped away with her thumb, whispering soft reassurances in Spanish that helped calm both of them. But the damage had been done. Nathan had learned that Rosa might not always respond to his distress, and Rosa had learned that her every interaction with him was being scrutinized for signs of inappropriate attachment. "Interesting," Mrs. Cromwell murmured, making a final note before tucking her clipboard under her arm. "We'll continue this evaluation tomorrow. I'll want to observe the bedtime routine to assess the level of dependency that's been established." After the consultant left, Rosa sat in the nursery rocking chair with Nathan asleep in her arms, both of them exhausted by the emotional manipulation they had endured. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows felt grayer than usual, as if even the sun was mourning the loss of innocence that occurred when love became subject to professional evaluation. Rosa understood now that she was fighting for more than just her job. She was fighting for Nathan's right to be loved without conditions, to form attachments based on trust rather than efficiency, to experience the kind of unconditional care that every child deserved. The battle lines were being drawn between those who saw emotional connections as complications to be managed and those who believed that love was the foundation upon which all other healing became possible. As the days shortened and the efficiency experts' evaluation continued, Rosa prepared herself for the confrontation she could feel building like storm clouds over the bay. She would not apologize for loving Nathan, would not pretend that her care for him was merely professional duty. Whatever consequences awaited her, she would meet them with the dignity that had carried her through decades of serving families who rarely understood the true value of what she offered. The sealed door at the end of the nursery seemed to pulse with its own secrets as afternoon faded toward evening. Rosa wondered if Elena Whitfield, wherever she was, would approve of the battle being fought over her son's right to be loved. Perhaps the answers locked away in that mysterious room would prove that some truths were worth defending, regardless of their efficiency or convenience. The confrontation Rosa had sensed building finally erupted on a gray Thursday morning that seemed designed for heartbreak. She arrived at the mansion to find Marcus waiting for her in the front hall, flanked by Mrs. Patterson and the efficiency expert, Mrs. Cromwell. Their formation was deliberately intimidating, a tribunal assembled to render judgment on crimes Rosa wasn't even sure she had committed. Nathan was nowhere to be seen, a strategic absence that immediately told Rosa this meeting was designed to proceed without the complications that his presence might introduce. Someone had calculated that it would be easier to discuss his future without having to confront the reality of his small face and trusting eyes. "Rosa," Marcus began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for firing employees or dissolving business partnerships. "We need to discuss some concerns about your performance here." The word performance felt like a slap. Rosa's work with Nathan hadn't been a performance. It had been love made visible through countless small acts of care, but she understood that in this context, her emotions were being reframed as professional failings rather than personal gifts. "Mr. Whitfield," she replied carefully, maintaining the respectful posture she had learned to adopt in moments of institutional power being wielded against her. Mrs. Cromwell stepped forward with her clipboard, ready to present the evidence she had gathered during her days of observation. "Our evaluation has revealed several areas where boundaries have become inappropriately blurred," she announced in the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "The child has developed an unhealthy level of dependency on you. which interferes with his emotional development and his relationship with his father. Rosa felt anger rising in her chest like heat from a furnace, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Nathan is more secure now than when I started working here," she said. "He sleeps through the night, his language development is accelerating, and he's learning to trust relationships again. Those seem like positive outcomes." "But at what cost?" Mrs. Patterson interjected, her voice sharp with years of accumulated resentment toward maids who forgot their place. "You've made yourself indispensable to the child, which creates problems for everyone else who needs to care for him. He cries when you leave, refuses comfort from other staff members, and has even started rejecting his father's attempts at connection because you've become his primary attachment figure." The accusation hit Rosa in a place that was already tender with doubt. It was true that Nathan preferred her comfort to others, true that he had learned to expect her presence during times of distress, but Mrs. Patterson was twisting these natural developments into evidence of manipulation, suggesting that Rosa had deliberately undermined other people's relationships with Nathan to make herself more valuable. "Children form attachments to people who are consistently kind to them," Rosa said, fighting to keep her voice level. "That's normal development, not manipulation." "Normal for family members," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since the initial introduction. "Not for employees." The words felt like a knife between Rosa's ribs. After months of caring for Nathan as if he were her own child, sacrificing sleep to comfort his nightmares, and celebrating his smallest developmental victories as if they were her personal triumphs, she was being reminded that she was just hired help. Her love didn't count because she wasn't family, wasn't wealthy, wasn't allowed to form the kinds of meaningful connections that might threaten the established hierarchy. "I never intended to overstep boundaries," Rosa said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were partially false. She had stepped over boundaries, deliberately, lovingly, because Nathan's needs had demanded it. She had chosen his emotional well-being over professional protocols, and she wasn't sorry for that choice even if it was about to cost her everything. Mrs. Cromwell consulted her notes with theatrical precision. "Our recommendations are threefold," she announced. "First, immediate implementation of strict professional boundaries regarding physical affection and emotional responses. Second, gradual transition of primary caregiving responsibilities to other staff members to reduce the child's dependency. Third, consideration of whether continued employment is in the best interests of all parties involved." The euphemisms couldn't disguise what was really being proposed. Rosa would be stripped of everything that made her effective at caring for Nathan, reduced to a cleaning lady who happened to work in the same room where a motherless child lived. And if she couldn't adapt to these restrictions, or if Nathan's distress at losing her emotional support proved too disruptive, she would be fired entirely. "I understand," Rosa said quietly, though understanding and accepting were entirely different things. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the cruelty of what was being demanded. "This isn't about your competence," he said, as if offering consolation. "You've done excellent work here, but Nathan needs to develop independence, and that requires reducing his reliance on any single caregiver." Rosa wondered if Marcus truly believed what he was saying, or if he was simply repeating justifications that others had provided to help him avoid confronting his own failure as a father. It was easier to blame her for Nathan's attachment issues than to acknowledge that his son was seeking from a paid caregiver the love and consistency he should have been receiving from his family. "When would these changes take effect?" Rosa asked, already planning how she would break the news to her mother that their financial situation was about to become more precarious. "Immediately," Mrs. Patterson replied with obvious satisfaction. "Starting today, your duties will focus exclusively on housekeeping. Nathan's personal care will be managed by other staff members who understand appropriate professional boundaries." The cruelty was breathtaking. Rosa was being forced to remain in the house where Nathan lived, but forbidden from comforting him when he cried for her. She would hear his distress through the walls, but be professionally prohibited from responding. It was a punishment designed to be as psychologically damaging as possible, breaking her heart while maintaining the fiction that she was being treated fairly. And if I can't work under those conditions? Rosa asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken aloud. Then we'll provide excellent references for future employment opportunities, Marcus said, falling back on corporate speak to avoid acknowledging that he was choosing institutional comfort over a child's emotional needs. Rosa looked at each of their faces in turn, memorizing the expressions of people who could convince themselves that cruelty was kindness when it served their interests. Mrs. Patterson's satisfied vindication, Mrs. Cromwell's professional detachment, Marcus's guilty relief at having someone else make the hard decisions for him. I need to get Nathan's room ready for whoever will be caring for him next, Rosa said finally. She turned and walked toward the stairs that led to the third floor, her back straight and her head high, despite the devastation rolling through her chest like an earthquake. Behind her, she could hear the three architects of Nathan's abandonment discussing logistics and timelines as if they were planning a corporate restructuring rather than destroying a child's sense of security. When Rosa reached the nursery, she found Nathan playing quietly with his blocks, unaware that his world was about to be shattered again. He looked up at her arrival with the bright smile that had become the best part of her days, babbling something that sounded almost like Rosa, but wasn't quite clear enough to count as a real word. She knelt beside him and gathered him into her arms, breathing in the scent of his hair and memorizing the weight of his small body against her chest. For the next few hours, she would continue to care for him as she always had, knowing that each interaction might be their last. I love you, mijo, she whispered against his hair, the words carrying all the tenderness she wouldn't be allowed to express once the new rules took effect. No matter what happens, remember that someone loves you exactly as you are. Nathan couldn't understand her words, but he settled into her embrace with the complete trust that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Rosa closed her eyes and rocked him gently, storing the moment against the loneliness that was coming for both of them. Outside the tall windows, fog was rolling in from the bay, obscuring the view of Alcatraz and the Golden Gate Bridge. The city was disappearing under layers of gray, much the same way that love and connection were being obscured by institutional policies in the Whitfield mansion. But Rosa had learned long ago that fog always lifted eventually, and truth had a way of emerging, no matter how many layers of deception were piled on top of it. The sealed door at the end of the nursery seemed to watch over their embrace, holding its secrets close, while Rosa prepared to say goodbye to the child who had claimed her heart so completely. Whatever happened next, she would not regret the love she had given or the risks she had taken to help Nathan heal. Some things were worth defending regardless of the personal cost, and the right of children to be loved unconditionally was certainly one of them. The new rules went into effect that very afternoon, transforming Rosa from a beloved caregiver into a stranger in a child's life. When Nathan woke from his nap crying for comfort, she was forbidden from picking him up. When he reached toward her during his afternoon snack, she had to redirect his attention to the new temporary nanny who had been hastily hired to implement the recommended changes. When he toddled toward her with his arms outstretched, she was required to step back and encourage him to seek affection elsewhere. The cruelty of the situation was compounded by Nathan's confusion and distress. He couldn't understand why the person who had taught him to trust was suddenly unavailable to him, why his cries for Rosa went unanswered while she stood only a few feet away. His bewilderment gave way to frustration, then to a heartbroken acceptance that was somehow worse than anger would have been. By evening, Nathan had stopped reaching for Rosa entirely. He sat in his high chair picking at his dinner, occasionally glancing in her direction with eyes that seemed older and sadder than they had been that morning. Rosa cleaned around him with mechanical precision, her heart breaking with each small sign that he was learning to protect himself from further disappointment by withdrawing from connection entirely. The temporary nanny, a stern woman named Mrs. Burke, who had been trained in the latest techniques for maintaining professional boundaries, observed Nathan's distress with clinical detachment. Children are remarkably adaptable, she told Rosa as they passed in the hallway. A few days of consistency with the new approach and he'll forget he ever had inappropriate attachments to staff members. Rosa wanted to scream that Nathan's attachment to her hadn't been inappropriate. It had been healing, necessary, the first healthy relationship the child had ever been allowed to form. But she bit her tongue and continued with her work, focusing on the tasks that were still within her purview: organizing, cleaning, maintaining the physical environment while being forbidden from nurturing the small soul who lived within it. The next morning brought the inevitable consequence of traumatic separation. Nathan's developmental progress began to reverse. He woke screaming from nightmares that had disappeared months earlier, his cries echoing through the mansion with renewed desperation. During the day, he became increasingly withdrawn, losing interest in the toys and activities that had previously engaged him. His tentative attempts at language stalled, and he began exhibiting self-soothing behaviors that child development experts recognized as signs of abandonment trauma. Mrs. Burke documented these developments with professional concern, but attributed them to temporary adjustment difficulties, rather than acknowledging that the new policies were actively harmful. She increased Nathan's structured activities and reduced his opportunities for free play, believing that distraction would help him overcome his attachment issues more quickly. Rosa watched this systematic destruction of Nathan's emotional security with growing horror. She had seen children recover from trauma before, had witnessed the gradual building of trust that allowed them to risk vulnerability again. Now she was watching that process reverse in real time, observing a little boy who was learning that love was conditional and could be withdrawn without warning for reasons he couldn't understand. On the third day of the new regime, Rosa made a decision that she knew would probably cost her job, but that her conscience wouldn't allow her to avoid. She was cleaning the bathroom adjoining the nursery when she heard Nathan's cries escalating to the level of psychological distress that no child should have to endure alone. Mrs. Burke had stepped out to prepare his lunch, leaving him strapped into a bouncy seat where he couldn't hurt himself, but also couldn't seek comfort. Rosa dropped her cleaning supplies and went to him immediately, lifting him from the seat and holding him against her chest while he sobbed out his confusion and pain. His small body shook with the force of emotions too big for such a small person to carry, and Rosa felt her own tears mixing with his as she rocked him gently. "I know, mijo," she whispered in Spanish, the language of her heart that no institutional policy could regulate. "I know it hurts, but you are loved, even when the people who love you aren't allowed to show it." Nathan's crying gradually subsided as Rosa's familiar presence worked its gentle magic, his body remembering the safety he had learned to associate with her arms. For a few precious minutes, they existed in the bubble of connection that had characterized their relationship before outside forces intervened to destroy it. But the bubble burst when Mrs. Burke returned to find them together. The temporary nanny's face flushed with outrage as she witnessed what she clearly viewed as insubordination and unprofessional boundary violation. "Put him down immediately," Mrs. Burke commanded. "You're undoing all the progress we've made in teaching him appropriate expectations." Rosa looked down at Nathan, who had finally stopped crying, but was clinging to her shirt with desperate fingers. She could put him down and return to her cleaning duties, preserving her job while sacrificing his emotional well-being. Or she could choose his needs over her own security and accept whatever consequences followed. "He's just a baby," Rosa said quietly, making her choice. "He needs comfort, not lessons in professional boundaries." Mrs. Burke's expression hardened. "I'm reporting this incident to Mrs. Patterson immediately. You've been given clear instructions about maintaining appropriate distance, and you've chosen to disregard them. This behavior is grounds for immediate termination." Rosa nodded, understanding that her time in the Whitfield house was ending, but feeling no regret about the decision that had triggered this consequence. She held Nathan for a few more seconds, memorizing the weight of him in her arms, before carefully placing him back in his bouncy seat. "Goodbye, mi amor," she whispered, knowing that he would remember her love long after he forgot the sound of her voice. Within an hour, Rosa found herself back in the front hall, where this chapter of her life had begun, her few personal belongings packed in the same small bag she had carried when she first walked through the mansion's imposing doors. Mrs. Patterson handled the dismissal with bureaucratic efficiency, presenting a final paycheck and a letter of recommendation that praised Rosa's housekeeping skills while carefully avoiding any mention of her extraordinary gifts as a caregiver. "You brought this on yourself," Mrs. Patterson said as Rosa signed the paperwork acknowledging her termination. "We gave you a chance to adjust to reasonable professional expectations, and you chose to prioritize your own emotional needs over your employment requirements." Rosa accepted the accusation without arguing, though she knew it was exactly backward. She had prioritized Nathan's emotional needs over her own security, had chosen his well-being over her paycheck, had sacrificed her own stability to provide him with the comfort that no institutional policy should ever prohibit. As she walked down the long driveway toward the bus stop, Rosa could hear Nathan's renewed crying echoing from the nursery windows above. The sound followed her onto the bus and back to her small apartment in the Mission, a reminder that some forms of institutional cruelty left wounds in multiple hearts simultaneously. But Rosa's story was not over. The love she had shared with Nathan, the healing they had accomplished together, and the truth about what children really needed to thrive. These things existed independently of employment policies and professional boundaries. And sometimes, when powerful people made decisions based on fear rather than wisdom, the universe had ways of revealing their mistakes in the harsh light of consequences they hadn't anticipated. The sealed door in the nursery held secrets that might yet prove that Rosa's approach had been right all along, that love was not a luxury but a necessity, and that some truths were too important to remain locked away forever. Marcus Whitfield discovered the true cost of institutional efficiency exactly 1 week after Rosa's dismissal. He was working late in his study, trying to concentrate on quarterly investment reports, while Nathan's screams echoed through the mansion like an air raid siren. The new nanny had assured him that children adapted quickly to changed circumstances, but Nathan's distress seemed to intensify each night rather than diminishing. The numbers on Marcus's computer screen blurred as he rubbed his tired eyes. His cryptocurrency portfolio had gained 3% that day, adding another $1 million to his already incomprehensible wealth. His real estate investments were performing above expectations, and his venture capital fund had just closed a deal that would generate returns for decades to come. By every financial metric that mattered to the world, Marcus Whitfield was having an extraordinarily successful week. But success felt meaningless when measured against the sound of his son's anguish. Marcus closed his laptop and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, something he had avoided doing since Rosa's termination. The contrast between the house's lower levels and Nathan's domain was jarring. Downstairs, everything remained pristine and elegant, but the nursery felt like a war zone of abandoned hope. Nathan was standing in his crib, gripping the rails with white knuckles, his face red and swollen from hours of crying. Mrs. Burke sat in the corner, reading a child psychology manual, occasionally glancing up to make clinical observations about his behavior, but making no move to comfort him. "How long has he been like this?" Marcus asked, though he had been hearing the cries for hours. "Since his afternoon nap," Mrs. Burke replied without looking up from her book. "The literature suggests that responding to attention-seeking behavior reinforces dependency patterns. He needs to learn self-soothing techniques." Marcus stared at his son, recognizing something in Nathan's exhausted desperation that he had never noticed before. The child wasn't seeking attention. He was grieving. The person who had taught him to trust had disappeared without explanation, and now he was experiencing the kind of abandonment trauma that Marcus himself understood all too well. "Pick him up," Marcus said quietly. Mrs. Burke looked up from her manual. "Mr. Whitfield, the efficiency expert specifically recommended against immediate responses to distress behaviors. Children need to develop emotional regulation skills independently." "Pick him up," Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the authority that had built billion-dollar business empires. Mrs. Burke reluctantly stood and approached the crib, but her movements were mechanical rather than nurturing. When she lifted Nathan, he continued crying, clearly understanding that these arms could provide physical safety, but not the emotional connection he craved. Marcus watched his son struggle in the embrace of someone who was technically competent, but emotionally unavailable, and suddenly understood what Rosa had been trying to tell him months earlier. Efficiency was the wrong metric for measuring success with children. Nathan didn't need professional caregiving. He needed love that couldn't be regulated, standardized, or made more efficient. "Where is Rosa?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Terminated for failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries," Mrs. Burke replied, as if reciting from a human resources manual. "The transition period is always difficult, but children adapt remarkably quickly to new caregiving arrangements." But Nathan wasn't adapting. If anything, his distress seemed to deepen each day, as if he was finally understanding that Rosa's absence wasn't temporary. The developmental progress that had been so encouraging under her care was reversing rapidly, replaced by regression patterns that child psychologists associated with trauma and abandonment. Marcus took his son from Mrs. Burke's arms, feeling Nathan's small body tense rather than relax against his chest. Even his own father's embrace couldn't provide the comfort that Nathan sought, because Marcus had spent so many months avoiding emotional connection that Nathan had learned not to expect it from him. "Leave us alone," Marcus told the nanny. After Mrs. Burke departed, Marcus carried Nathan to the rocking chair, where Rosa had spent countless hours building the foundation of trust that was now crumbling. He tried to replicate her gentle swaying motion, but Nathan continued to cry, perhaps sensing that his father's attempted comfort was motivated more by guilt than by genuine understanding of his needs. As Marcus rocked his son awkwardly, his eyes were drawn to the sealed door at the far end of the nursery. For 2 years, he had refused to confront whatever truths lay beyond that barrier, choosing instead to lock away his grief along with Elena's memory. But watching Nathan's suffering now, Marcus began to understand that some secrets were too heavy to carry alone, and that healing might require facing the very truths he had spent so much energy avoiding. That night, after Nathan finally cried himself to sleep, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He retrieved the key to Elena's room from his desk drawer, the same key he had turned 2 years ago and sworn never to use again, and walked slowly back to the 3rd floor. The sealed door opened with a click that seemed to echo through the entire mansion. Inside, Elena's sitting room remained exactly as she had left it, books scattered across the small table where she had planned to read to Nathan, a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light, walls covered with sketches for the nursery murals she had designed but never had the chance to see completed. But it was Elena's journal, lying open on the window seat, that contained the revelations Marcus needed to understand. Her final entries, written in the weeks before her disappearance, told a story that he had refused to acknowledge because confronting it would have required admitting his own failures as a husband and father. Elena had not abandoned them, as the whispered rumors suggested. She had not run away with another man or succumbed to postpartum depression as some of their friends speculated. According to her journal, she had been battling a rare postpartum condition that caused severe cognitive dissonance and memory fragmentation, a condition that made her fear she might inadvertently harm Nathan during her episodes of confusion. Rather than risk hurting their son, Elena had made the agonizing decision to enter a specialized treatment facility, planning to return once her condition stabilized. But complications from her treatment had led to her death just 3 months after Nathan's birth, leaving behind a grieving husband who had been too proud to seek emotional support and a baby who would grow up believing his mother had chosen to leave him. The journal entries revealed Elena's desperate love for Nathan and her anguish at having to separate from him temporarily for his own safety. She had planned the sitting room as a space where she would bond with him after her recovery, had chosen every detail with the kind of thoughtful love that Marcus had never fully appreciated while she was alive. More importantly, the journal contained Elena's insights about the kind of care Nathan would need if she couldn't be there to provide it herself. She had written extensively about the importance of consistent nurturing relationships, about the way children's emotional development depended on feeling truly known and loved by their caregivers. Her observations read like a blueprint for exactly the approach Rosa had instinctively provided. He will need someone who sees him as whole person, not just a small human to be managed, Elena had written. Someone who understands that love is not a luxury but a necessity, that emotional connection is the foundation upon which all other development rests. If I cannot be that person for him, I pray that he finds someone who can love him as completely as I do. Marcus sat in Elena's rocking chair, surrounded by evidence of her love and wisdom, finally understanding the magnitude of his failures. He had honored Elena's memory by preserving her physical spaces while completely ignoring her emotional insights. He had hired professional caregivers when what Nathan needed was someone capable of genuine love. Most significantly, he had allowed institutional policies to destroy the one relationship that had provided Nathan with the consistent nurturing Elena had prayed he would find. Rosa had loved Nathan exactly as Elena had hoped someone would, and Marcus had fired her for it. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over with grief and regret. Nathan had been blessed with a caregiver who intuitively understood what he needed to heal from his early trauma, and Marcus had allowed fear and pride to destroy that relationship. He had chosen the appearance of professional boundaries over his son's emotional well-being, had prioritized institutional comfort over the healing power of unconditional love. As dawn broke over San Francisco Bay, Marcus finally understood that efficiency had been the wrong goal entirely. Nathan didn't need better management. He needed what Rosa had offered him freely, the kind of love that wasn't contingent on behavioral outcomes or developmental milestones, love that existed simply because children deserved to be cherished exactly as they were. The healing that Nathan required couldn't be purchased with stock dividends or cryptocurrency gains, couldn't be achieved through consulting reports or professional protocols. It could only emerge from the kind of authentic human connection that Rosa had provided, and that Marcus, in his grief and fear, had been too broken to recognize as the most valuable gift his son could receive. Marcus spent the morning hours in Elena's room, reading her journal entries and studying the sketches she had drawn of Nathan, as she imagined he might look at various stages of his development. By the time Mrs. Burke arrived to begin Nathan's morning routine, Marcus had made a decision that would require more courage than any business venture he had ever undertaken. He was going to find Rosa and ask for forgiveness, not just for himself, but for Nathan, who deserved the chance to heal in the arms of someone who had already proven her capacity to love him without conditions or limitations. It would mean admitting that his institutional approach had been wrong, that efficiency was a poor substitute for human connection, that the best investment he could make in Nathan's future had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. The journey from Pacific Heights to Rosa's neighborhood in the Mission District was more than just a physical distance. It was a crossing between worlds that Marcus had never attempted before. As his Tesla navigated the steep streets and changing neighborhoods, he found himself seeing San Francisco through different eyes, the elegant mansions giving way to modest apartments, luxury giving way to authenticity, privilege giving way to the kind of resilience that came from surviving rather than inheriting. When Marcus finally stood outside Rosa's small apartment building, holding a letter that contained both apology and plea, he understood that what he was asking for couldn't be commanded or purchased. Rosa had every right to refuse him, every reason to protect herself from further heartbreak. But Nathan's future, and perhaps Marcus's own redemption, depended on whether she could find it in her heart to give them both another chance. Rosa answered her door, wearing the kind of surprise that came from seeing someone completely out of context. Marcus Whitfield, tech billionaire and venture capitalist, standing on the doorstep of her Mission District apartment like a character who had wandered out of one story into another entirely. His expensive car was parked at the curb, attracting curious glances from her neighbors, and his tailored suit looked absurdly formal against the backdrop of Rosa's working-class neighborhood. "Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully, not hiding her confusion, "is everything okay? Is Nathan hurt?" The immediate concern in her voice for a child she was no longer employed to care for told Marcus everything he needed to know about the authenticity of her love. Even after being dismissed for inappropriate attachment, Rosa's first thought was for Nathan's well-being rather than her own circumstances. "He's not physically hurt," Marcus replied, though the qualification in his answer made Rosa's expression tighten with worry. "But I know that firing you was a mistake, a terrible mistake that I need to make right if you'll let me." Rosa stepped back, gesturing for him to enter the small apartment that served as home for her, her aging mother, and her sister Maria, who was studying nursing at City College. The contrast between this modest space and the Whitfield mansion was jarring. Everything here was functional rather than decorative, chosen for durability rather than beauty. But the apartment radiated warmth in ways that Marcus's house never had, filled with the kind of life that came from people who genuinely cared about each other. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Rosa asked, falling back on the hospitality that had been trained into her through decades of service work. "Thank you, but no," Marcus replied, understanding that accepting refreshments would add another layer of complexity to an already difficult conversation. "I need to apologize to you, and I need to ask for your help, though I'm not sure I have any right to either." Rosa's mother, Carmen, emerged from the kitchen where she had been preparing lunch, moving slowly with the careful steps of someone managing arthritis and dignity in equal measure. She studied Marcus with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 78 years learning to read people's intentions beneath their polished surfaces. "Mama, this is Mr. Whitfield," Rosa explained in Spanish, "Nathan's father." Carmen nodded politely but didn't extend her hand, clearly reserving judgment about this wealthy man who had appeared unexpectedly in their home. She settled into her favorite chair, a strategic position that allowed her to observe the conversation while making it clear that Rosa was not alone or unprotected. "I found Elena's journal," Marcus said without preamble, deciding that directness was the only approach that might pierce through the layers of hurt and misunderstanding that his previous decisions had created. "I finally opened the room I sealed after her death, and I learned things about what happened that I should have known 2 years ago." Rosa's expression softened slightly at the mention of Elena, the mother whose absence had shaped so much of Nathan's early life. She had wondered many times about the woman whose room remained sealed, whose loss had carved such deep wounds in both father and son. "She didn't abandon us," Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke the words that had taken him so long to understand. "She was fighting a condition that made her afraid she might hurt Nathan accidentally, so she entered treatment to get better. But she died there, and I was too proud and too broken to tell anyone the truth. I let people think she had chosen to leave, because somehow that felt easier to accept than the reality that she died trying to become the mother Nathan needed." Carmen made a soft sound of sympathy, her maternal instincts responding to the pain in Marcus's voice despite her reservations about his treatment of her daughter. Rosa remained still, absorbing this revelation about the mystery that had haunted the Whitfield house since her first day there. "Elena wrote about what Nathan would need if she couldn't be there to care for him herself," Marcus continued, pulling the folded journal pages from his jacket pocket. "She described exactly the kind of love and attention you provided for him. You were the answer to her prayers, and I destroyed that relationship because I was too afraid of genuine connection to recognize its value." Rosa studied Marcus's face, searching for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivation, but finding only regret and desperate hope. "What are you asking for?" she said finally. "I'm asking you to come back," Marcus replied simply. "Not as an employee with restricted responsibilities, but as, I don't even know what to call it, as Nathan's emotional guardian, as the person who loves him the way Elena wanted him to be loved, as someone who can help both of us learn how to be a family instead of just people who live in the same house." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. Rosa felt her heart respond to the idea of returning to Nathan, of continuing the healing work that had been interrupted so cruelly. but she also remembered the pain of watching him cry while being forbidden to comfort him. The humiliation of having her love reframed as professional misconduct. "The efficiency expert," Rosa said. "Mrs. Patterson, the rules about professional boundaries. What's changed?" "I fired them all," Marcus replied with a bitter satisfaction. "Mrs. Cromwell, Mrs. Burke, even Mrs. Patterson. I realized that their definition of efficiency was destroying the most important thing in Nathan's life. Elena's journal made me understand that love isn't inefficient. It's the foundation that makes everything else possible." Carmen spoke for the first time since the introductions, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and recognized truth when she heard it. "Mija," she said to Rosa in Spanish, "this man has learned something, but learning and changing are different things." "You must decide if you believe he can do both," Rosa translated for Marcus, who nodded solemnly at Carmen's wisdom. "Your mother is right to be skeptical," he said. "I've made mistakes that hurt both you and Nathan. But I'm asking for the chance to do better, to build something that honors Elena's memory and Nathan's needs instead of my own fears." "What would be different this time?" Rosa asked. "What guarantees do I have that you won't change your mind again when someone else suggests that loving Nathan too much is problematic?" It was the practical question that Rosa's years of economic vulnerability had taught her to ask. She couldn't afford to lose another job because someone decided her humanity was inconvenient, couldn't risk her family's financial stability on promises that might evaporate the first time Marcus felt uncomfortable with authentic emotion. "No guarantees," Marcus admitted with devastating honesty, "except that I finally understand what Elena was trying to tell me and what you were showing me through your care for Nathan. Love isn't something to be managed or made more efficient. It's the point of everything else we do." He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out an envelope that Rosa recognized as the kind used by attorneys for important documents. "I've had my lawyers draw up an employment contract that's different from anything I've ever offered before," Marcus explained. "It includes protections that ensure you can never be fired for providing emotional support to Nathan, guidelines that specifically authorize you to use your judgment about his needs rather than following institutional protocols, and financial terms that recognize the true value of what you bring to our family." Rosa accepted the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. The gesture showed respect for Marcus's offer, while making it clear that money, while important, wasn't the decisive factor in her decision. "He's been crying every night since you left," Marcus continued, abandoning any pretense of stoic composure. "Mrs. Burke kept saying he would adapt, but he's not adapting. He's grieving. I've realized that he's lost 2 mothers now, Elena through death and you through my stupidity. I can't bring Elena back, but maybe you could find it in your heart to forgive us both for the pain we've caused." Carmen watched this exchange with growing approval, recognizing in Marcus's vulnerability the kind of authentic remorse that might actually lead to changed behavior. She had seen too many powerful men offer apologies that were really just manipulation, but something in Marcus's manner suggested that his understanding of his mistakes was genuine. "Rosa worked miracles with that boy," Carmen said in English, addressing Marcus directly for the first time. "She came home every day talking about his progress, his smiles, the way he was learning to trust. When you fired her, she cried for 3 days, not for herself, but for him. That tells you what kind of person my daughter is." "I know," Marcus replied, meeting Carmen's eyes with the respect due to someone who had raised the woman he was asking to save his family. "I'm not sure I deserve her forgiveness, but Nathan deserves the chance to heal with someone who already loves him." Rosa finally opened the envelope and scanned the contract terms, her eyebrows rising as she absorbed the financial details. The salary being offered was more than double her previous pay, with benefits that would provide security not just for her, but for her entire family. It was the kind of economic transformation that working-class families dreamed about but rarely experienced. But more important than the money were the written guarantees about her autonomy in caring for Nathan, the specific language protecting her right to provide emotional support without interference from future consultants or efficiency experts. Marcus was offering not just employment, but partnership in Nathan's healing, recognition that her insights and instincts were valuable rather than problematic. "I need to think about this," Rosa said finally, though her heart was already reaching toward the little boy who had claimed such a large piece of it. "Of course," Marcus replied, standing to leave. "Take all the time you need. But if you do decide to give us another chance, I want you to know that things will be different. Elena's room is unlocked now, and I'm finally ready to grieve properly and help Nathan understand his mother's love for him. I'm ready to be present as a father instead of hiding behind work and institutional policies. And I'm ready to acknowledge that the best thing I can do for my son is support his relationship with someone who has already proven her capacity to love him unconditionally." After Marcus left, Rosa sat with her mother in the small living room, both women processing the unexpected turn their afternoon had taken. The contract lay open between them, its generous terms a testament to Marcus's desperation and perhaps his genuine transformation. "What does your heart tell you, mija?" Carmen asked gently. "That Nathan needs me," Rosa replied without hesitation. "That he's probably lying in his crib right now wondering why I disappeared, just like his mother did. That maybe I could help heal those wounds if I'm brave enough to try again." "And what does your head tell you?" Rosa smiled at her mother's wisdom. "Recognizing the importance of balancing emotional and practical considerations. That this is a chance to change our family's circumstances in ways I never thought possible. That the contract protections are strong enough to prevent what happened before, and that maybe sometimes wealthy people can actually learn from their mistakes if the consequences are painful enough." That evening, as Rosa walked through the Mission District considering Marcus's offer, she found herself thinking about second chances and whether people were capable of genuine transformation. The neighborhood around her was full of stories of redemption and resilience, families who had survived immigration, poverty, and discrimination to build lives of dignity and purpose. Perhaps Marcus Whitfield, despite his wealth and privilege, was capable of the same kind of growth. Perhaps Nathan's need for healing could become the catalyst for his father's emotional development as well as his own. And perhaps Rosa's gifts as a caregiver could find their truest expression in helping to repair a family that had been broken by loss and fear. By the time she returned to her apartment, Rosa had made her decision. She would give Nathan and his father another chance, not because she was certain of the outcome, but because love sometimes required leaping into uncertainty with faith that the landing would be softer than the current reality. Nathan deserved that chance, and maybe Rosa did too. The reunion took place on a Wednesday morning when the fog was finally lifting from the bay, revealing glimpses of blue sky that seemed to promise better days ahead. Rosa approached the Whitfield mansion with her small bag of belongings and a heart full of cautious hope, aware that this second chance represented something precious and fragile that would need to be protected carefully. Marcus met her at the front door himself, an unprecedented gesture that immediately signaled how much had changed in the house's dynamics. Gone was the formal employer-employee distance that had characterized their previous interactions. In its place was something that felt more like partnership, a shared commitment to Nathan's well-being that transcended traditional hierarchical boundaries. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, the words carrying more weight than any lengthy speech could have conveyed. "For giving us another chance, for believing that people can change, for loving my son when I wasn't capable of it." Rosa nodded, accepting his gratitude while maintaining the dignity that had carried her through their previous difficulties. "Where is Nathan?" she asked, her primary concern immediately focused on the child, who had been without her comfort for far too long. "In his room," Marcus replied, his expression tightening with worry. He's not doing well, Rosa. The night terrors are back, worse than they were when you first arrived. He barely eats, doesn't play with his toys, just sits by the window as if he's waiting for something that never comes." The description broke Rosa's heart, confirming her worst fears about how Nathan had processed her sudden disappearance from his life. Children his age couldn't understand complex explanations about employment policies or professional boundaries. They only knew that someone they loved had vanished without warning, triggering all the abandonment fears that had been built into his earliest experiences. They climbed the stairs to the third floor together, Marcus's expensive shoes silent on the thick carpeting that had muffled so many of Nathan's cries over the past weeks. As they approached the nursery, Rosa could hear the absence of sound that marked a child's depression. No babbling, no movement, just the heavy quiet of someone too young to understand despair, but old enough to feel it completely. Nathan was exactly where Marcus had described him, sitting by the tall windows that overlooked the bay, his small body motionless, except for the occasional shuddering breath that suggested he was fighting back tears. He had lost weight during Rosa's absence, his face thinner and his eyes holding the hollow look of someone who had stopped hoping for comfort. When he heard footsteps entering the room, Nathan turned with the cautious movements of a child who had learned not to expect good things. But when his eyes met Rosa's, something electric passed between them, recognition, joy, and relief, mixing into an expression of pure emotional release that was heartbreaking in its intensity. "Rosa!" Nathan cried, the first clear word he had spoken in weeks, his voice hoarse from disuse but unmistakably filled with happiness. He toddled toward her on unsteady legs, arms outstretched with the complete trust that had always characterized their relationship. Rosa knelt to receive him. Gathering his small body into her arms and feeling the way he melted against her chest, with the desperate relief of someone who had been holding themselves together through sheer force of will. "I'm here, mi amor," she whispered against his hair, her own tears mixing with his as they clung to each other. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere again." Nathan's response was to burrow deeper into her embrace, his small hands fisting in her shirt as if he could physically prevent her from leaving again. His tears came in great shuddering waves that seemed to release weeks of accumulated grief and confusion, the kind of cathartic crying that signaled the beginning of healing rather than ongoing distress. Marcus watched this reunion from the doorway, understanding with perfect clarity that what he was witnessing couldn't be replicated through institutional protocols or professional caregiving techniques. The connection between Rosa and Nathan was something organic and irreplaceable, built on genuine love rather than job requirements. Over the following hours, Nathan seemed to bloom like a flower that had been waiting for rain. His appetite returned, his interest in toys and activities revived, and most importantly, his trust in the stability of love began to rebuild. He followed Rosa around the nursery as she reacquainted herself with their shared space, babbling in the mixture of Spanish and English that she had always encouraged, his face bright with the kind of contentment that made the mansion feel like home for the first time since Elena's death. But the changes in the house extended far beyond Nathan's immediate recovery. Marcus had used Rosa's absence to implement the kind of comprehensive transformation that his son's needs demanded. Mrs. Patterson's replacement was a warmly competent woman named Sarah, who understood that emotional connections between staff and family members were assets to be supported rather than problems to be solved. The rigid protocols that had governed Nathan's daily routine were replaced with flexible approaches that prioritized his emotional state over scheduling efficiency. Most significantly, Elena's room had been restored to its original purpose as a space for connection and memory rather than sealed grief. The rocking chair where Elena had planned to nurse Nathan now served as the place where Rosa told him stories about his mother, sharing age-appropriate narratives about how much Elena had loved him even though her illness prevented her from staying with him. "Your mama wanted to take care of you herself," Rosa would tell Nathan as they rocked together in the afternoon light. "But sometimes people get sick in ways that make that impossible. She went to try to get better so she could come back to you, but her sickness was too strong. But her love for you was stronger than anything, and that love is still here in this room, in this house, in your heart. These conversations were part of a broader effort to help Nathan develop a coherent narrative about his family history rather than the confusion and abandonment fears that had previously dominated his understanding of his origins. With Marcus's full support, Rosa created photo albums and memory books that celebrated Elena's life and love, helping Nathan understand that he was the product of a wanted pregnancy and a marriage filled with hope for his future. Marcus himself underwent his own healing process during this period, finally allowing himself to grieve Elena's death properly, rather than hiding behind work and emotional numbness. He began attending therapy sessions that helped him process his guilt about Elena's final months, his regrets about the support he had failed to provide during her illness, and his fears about repeating his mistakes as a single parent. This therapeutic work translated into a dramatically different approach to fatherhood. Marcus began spending real time with Nathan, not just the scheduled visits that busy executives fit into their calendars, but extended periods where he was fully present and emotionally available. He learned to change diapers and prepare bottles, to read bedtime stories and sing lullabies, to provide comfort during night terrors and celebration during developmental milestones. The transformation wasn't always smooth. Marcus struggled with the vulnerability that genuine parenting required, occasionally falling back on the emotional distance that had protected him during his years of grief. But Rosa was there to guide him through these moments, offering encouragement when his confidence wavered and practical advice when his inexperience showed. "Parenting isn't about being perfect," she would remind him during their evening conversations in Elena's sitting room, which had become their informal headquarters for planning Nathan's care. "It's about being present, about letting him see that you're learning alongside him, about showing him that love means staying even when things are difficult." As autumn progressed toward winter, the changes in the Whitfield household became undeniable to everyone who encountered them. Nathan was developing into a confident, affectionate child whose developmental milestones consistently exceeded expectations for his age. His vocabulary expanded daily, his social skills flourished, and his capacity for joy seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. More remarkably, Marcus was becoming the kind of father that Elena had hoped he could be, involved, emotionally available, and committed to Nathan's well-being above all other considerations. His business investments continued to generate enormous wealth, but he had learned to see financial success as a tool for providing security rather than as an end in itself. The house itself reflected these internal changes, becoming warmer and more welcoming as the frozen grief that had dominated its atmosphere finally began to thaw. Rosa's influence extended throughout the mansion, bringing touches of humanity and comfort that money couldn't purchase, but love could provide. Friends and business associates who visited the Whitfield home remarked on the transformation, though few understood the role that Rosa had played in making it possible. They saw a successful businessman who had finally learned to balance work and family, a motherless child who was thriving despite early trauma, and a household that functioned with warmth and efficiency. What they couldn't see were the countless small moments that had made this healing possible. Rosa singing Spanish lullabies during Nathan's afternoon naps, Marcus learning to braid hair and tie shoes, the three of them working together to plant a memorial garden for Elena in the mansion's previously sterile backyard. These everyday acts of love and patience had rebuilt a family from its foundations, creating something stronger and more authentic than what had existed before tragedy struck. Rosa's own life had been transformed as well. The financial security provided by her new contract allowed her to move her family to a larger apartment in a safer neighborhood to ensure that her mother received better medical care, and to support her sister's educational goals without the constant anxiety about money that had characterized so much of her adult life. But more than the material improvements, Rosa found deep satisfaction in the knowledge that her work was making a genuine difference in the lives of people she had come to love. Nathan's healing validated her belief that children needed emotional connection above all else, while Marcus's growth proved that even adults could learn to be better if they were willing to face their fears and vulnerabilities. As Christmas approached, Rosa suggested that they create new traditions that honored Elena's memory while building positive associations for Nathan's future. They decorated Elena's sitting room with lights and garland, transforming it from a shrine to loss into a celebration of ongoing love. They prepared traditional Mexican holiday foods alongside the American dishes that Elena had favored, creating a fusion of cultures that reflected the family's evolving identity. Most importantly, they used the holiday season to establish patterns of gratitude and connection that would anchor Nathan's sense of security for years to come. Each evening, the three of them would gather in Elena's room to share stories about their day, to express appreciation for each other, and to remember Elena's love in ways that felt comforting rather than painful. "She would be so happy to see you now," Rosa would tell Nathan as they looked through photo albums together, pointing to pictures of Elena during her pregnancy when her face glowed with anticipation of his arrival. "She would be proud of how kind and smart and loving you are, just like she knew you would be." These conversations helped Nathan develop a relationship with his mother's memory that was based on love rather than loss, understanding rather than confusion. He began to show Elena's photographs to visitors, telling them proudly about "my mama who loved me," in a way that demonstrated his growing security in his family story. For Marcus, watching these interactions was both healing and humbling. He saw how Rosa's intuitive understanding of Nathan's emotional needs had created what all his wealth and resources had failed to provide, a sense of belonging and unconditional love that allowed Nathan to thrive rather than merely survive. The sealed door that had symbolized so much pain and denial was now open permanently, Elena's room integrated into the family's daily life rather than locked away like a tomb. It had become a place where Nathan could connect with his mother's memory, where Marcus could process his grief constructively, and where Rosa could honor the woman whose journal had provided such crucial insights about the kind of care Nathan needed. As the year drew to a close, the Whitfield household had been transformed from a monument to successful business ventures into something much more valuable. A home where love was the highest priority, where emotional connection took precedence over efficiency, and where a child could grow up knowing he was cherished exactly as he was. The journey from institutional coldness to familial warmth had required courage from all involved. Nathan's trust despite repeated abandonment, Marcus's willingness to confront his own failures, and Rosa's faith that changed circumstances could lead to genuine transformation. But their collective investment in love over self-protection had created something precious and durable, a family bond that could weather future challenges because it was built on foundations of authentic care rather than obligation or convenience. On New Year's Eve, as they sat together in Elena's room watching fireworks burst over San Francisco Bay, Rosa reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them all to this moment. A wealthy man's grief, a poor woman's compassion, and a motherless child's need for love had combined to create healing that transcended class boundaries and cultural differences. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, echoing words he had spoken many times over the past months, but which never seemed adequate to express his gratitude. "For saving us, for teaching us what family really means, for showing us that love isn't a luxury but a necessity." Rosa smiled, holding Nathan as he dozed against her chest, his small body completely relaxed in the security of her arms. "We saved each other," she replied, understanding that their healing had been mutual rather than one-directional. Nathan had given her the satisfaction of meaningful work. Marcus had provided financial security and respect for her gifts, and together they had created something that none of them could have achieved alone. Outside the windows, the city of San Francisco sparkled with celebration and possibility. Inside Elena's room, three people who had found each other across differences of class and culture continued the quiet work of building a family based on love, patience, and the revolutionary belief that emotional connection was the most valuable investment any of them could make. The sealed door was open, the secrets were shared, and the future stretched ahead of them, filled with the promise that comes when people choose love over fear, healing over hiding, and relationship over isolation. Elena's dream for Nathan's happiness had been realized, not in the way she had originally planned, but through the unexpected grace of hearts that had learned to be larger than the circumstances that might have closed them. 2 years after Rose's return to the Whitfield household, the transformation was complete but never finished. Nathan, now 4 years old, raced through the mansion's halls with the confident energy of a child who had never doubted his place in the world, his laughter echoing off marble surfaces that had once known only silence and grief. His vocabulary sparkled with words in both Spanish and English, his stories filled with adventures shared with Rosa Mia and Daddy, and memories of Mama Elena who watches from heaven. The boy who had once stood crying at his crib rails, reaching toward sealed doors and unanswered questions, had become the joyful center of a household rebuilt on foundations of unconditional love. His development exceeded every milestone, but more importantly, his capacity for trust and emotional connection showed no scars from his earliest trauma. Rose's patient healing had given him the gift of believing that love was reliable, that care was consistent, and that home was a place where he would always belong. Marcus had completed his own metamorphosis from grieving widower to engaged father, though the journey had required daily choices to prioritize connection over comfort, vulnerability over control. His business empire continued to generate wealth that reached obscene proportions. Cryptocurrency investments alone had multiplied his fortune by factors that seemed almost fictional. But prosperity had ceased to be his primary identity. When colleagues asked about his greatest achievement, he no longer mentioned IPOs or venture capital successes. Instead, he talked about Nathan's first complete sentence, the family traditions they were building, the way his son's eyes lit up when he walked through the door each evening. "You would be amazed," Marcus often told Elena's photograph during their private conversations in her restored sitting room, "by the man I'm becoming because of the boy you gave me. I think you would approve of who we're becoming together." Elena's room had evolved into the heart of the house, no longer a sealed monument to loss, but a living space where family traditions were born and memories were made. Nathan played with blocks on the carpet where his mother had once planned to read him stories, and Rosa sang him to sleep in the rocking chair that Elena had chosen but never had the chance to use. The tragic gap between Elena's dreams and reality had been bridged not by denying her absence, but by honoring her hopes through their daily choices. Rosa had found in this work a calling that utilized every skill she possessed while providing the financial security her family had needed for decades. Her mother, Carmen, now lived in her own small apartment nearby. Her medical care fully covered, her dignity restored by independence earned through her daughter's success. Rosa's sister Maria had graduated from nursing school and was working at UCSF, her education funded by the generous salary that finally recognized Rosa's true value as a caregiver and healer. But beyond financial transformation, Rosa had discovered something even more precious, recognition that her gifts were not limitations to be overcome, but strengths to be celebrated. Her ability to love across boundaries of class and culture, to see potential in broken situations, to persist through rejection and misunderstanding. These qualities had saved a family and taught them all that healing was possible when people were brave enough to choose connection over protection. The household staff now included people who understood that emotional intelligence was as important as professional competence, that creating an environment where love could flourish required skills that couldn't be measured on efficiency charts. Sarah, the head of household, had become Rosa's trusted partner in managing not just logistics, but the subtle emotional work of maintaining a home where vulnerability was safe and growth was encouraged. One evening in early spring, as Rosa tucked Nathan into his bed and prepared to read him the same story about a little boy who learned that love was stronger than fear, he looked up at her with the serious expression he wore when processing something important. "Rosa, are you my second mama?" he asked, his small hand finding hers as they sat together in the dim light of his sailboat nightlight. The question had been building for months as Nathan's understanding of family structures became more sophisticated. He knew other children who had one mama or two mamas or mamas who lived away, and he was trying to categorize his own experience within frameworks that made sense to his developing mind. "I think," Rosa replied carefully, "that love doesn't follow rules about who can be family. Your mama Elena loved you before you were even born, and that love is always with you. I love you like you are my own son, and that love is always with you too. Having two mamas just means you are extra blessed, extra loved." Nathan nodded solemnly, filing this explanation away with the other truths he was collecting about his place in the world. "And Daddy loves me too," he added, not as a question, but as confirmation of something he accepted completely. "Yes, mijo. Daddy loves you more than all the money in his banks, more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the words in all the books we read together." "That's a lot of love," Nathan observed with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who had always been surrounded by it. "The most important people get the most love," Rosa replied, kissing his forehead as he settled into sleep with the unconscious security of a child who had never doubted his worth. Downstairs, Marcus was working in Elena's sitting room, not on business reports, but on a different kind of project that had emerged from his transformation. He was writing a book about second chances and redemption, about the way privilege could blind people to what really mattered, about the healing power of love that crossed every boundary society imposed. The book would never be published, wasn't intended for anyone beyond his own family, but the process of writing it had helped him understand the magnitude of the changes that Rosa's presence had made possible. Through her patient love of Nathan and her graceful forgiveness of his own failures, she had taught him that wealth was meaningless without relationship, that success was worthless without connection, that the only investments that truly mattered were the ones made in human hearts. "I was the richest man in the city when you met me," he wrote in a letter addressed to Rosa that would become the book's final chapter. "But I was starving for everything money couldn't buy. You taught Nathan to trust love again, but you also saved me from a life of emotional poverty that all my financial assets couldn't cure. The return on your investment in our family has been infinite, healing that multiplies rather than depletes, love that grows rather than diminishes, hope that expands rather than limits our future possibilities." As spring moved towards summer, the Whitfield household prepared for Nathan's 5th birthday with the kind of elaborate celebration that wealthy families were famous for hosting. But this party would be different from the typical Pacific Heights social event. The guest list included children from Nathan's diverse preschool, Rosa's family members, and neighbors from the Mission District who had become surrogate grandparents and aunts and uncles in the extended chosen family that had grown around their story. The birthday celebration would take place in Elena's memorial garden, where flowers bloomed in profusion around the small monument that honored her life and dreams. Nathan had helped plant some of the flowers himself, his small hands working alongside Rosa's and Marcus's to create something beautiful from dark soil, a living metaphor for what they had accomplished together. "Every year on your birthday," Rosa told Nathan as they prepared for the party, "we remember how lucky we are to have you in our lives. Your mama Elena dreamed about all your birthdays before you were even born, and now we get to celebrate them for her." Nathan accepted this tradition as naturally as he accepted all the other ways they kept Elena's love present in their daily lives. He would grow up knowing that love could transcend death, that families could be built from choice as well as biology, that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. The party itself became a celebration not just of Nathan's 5th year, but of the transformation that had touched every life in their extended community. Carmen taught the Pacific Heights children traditional Mexican games, bridging cultural divides through the universal language of play. Marcus grilled hamburgers alongside Rosa's brother-in-law, their conversation flowing easily as they discovered shared interests that transcended their different backgrounds. Most significantly, Nathan moved through the celebration with the confident joy of someone who knew himself to be unconditionally loved by a community that had chosen him as completely as he had chosen them. His security was visible in every interaction, his sense of belonging evident in the way he introduced Rosa as my Rosa and Marcus as my daddy and Elena as my mama in heaven with equal pride and affection. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial garden and the party began to wind down, Rosa found herself standing beside Elena's monument, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the sound of Nathan's laughter as he played with his new friends. She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, the sealed door that had hidden so much pain, the efficiency expert who had nearly destroyed their fragile progress, the night when she had chosen Nathan's healing over her own job security. Each crisis had contained the seeds of deeper transformation. Each challenge had revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed. Each choice to love rather than protect had opened possibilities that fear would have kept forever closed. "Thank you, Elena," Rosa whispered to the memorial stone, understanding that her gratitude was for more than just the journal entries that had provided such crucial insights. "Thank you for loving him first, for dreaming about the family he would need, for trusting that somehow love would find a way to reach him." Marcus appeared beside her, holding Nathan, who was tired from the day's excitement, but still glowing with happiness. The three of them stood together in the garden that Elena had never seen, but somehow helped create, surrounded by evidence of healing that had seemed impossible when Rosa first heard Nathan crying behind a sealed door. "She's here," Nathan said sleepily, pointing toward the jasmine flowers that were just beginning to open for their evening bloom. "Mama Elena is happy about my birthday." Neither Rosa nor Marcus questioned his certainty, understanding that some truths were larger than rational explanation. Love did transcend death, did live on in the hearts and choices of those left behind, did continue to guide and bless when people were brave enough to honor it through their actions. As evening settled over San Francisco and the last guests departed, Rosa reflected on the fullness of a life that had found its meaning in service that was indistinguishable from love. She had worked for wealthy families throughout her career, but only in the Whitfield household had she discovered that true prosperity was measured not in dollars or Bitcoin or stock portfolios, but in the transformation that occurred when people chose to invest in each other's healing rather than their own comfort. The sealed door that had haunted the mansion's silence was not only open now, but had become the threshold to the most important room in the house, a space where Elena's dreams lived on through Nathan's laughter, where Marcus's grief had transformed into grateful joy, where Rosa's gifts were finally recognized as the treasures they had always been. And you, have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Who saw past your title to recognize the wisdom you carry, the love you offer, the healing you make possible simply by being present with your whole heart? Have you ever been the answer to someone's prayer without even knowing it? The bridge between loss and hope that allows broken families to discover wholeness again? Your story matters just as much as Rosa's does. Your silent strength and persistent love have touched lives in ways you may never fully know, created transformations that ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. If this story has found you in a moment when you needed reminding that your work has meaning beyond paychecks and job descriptions, then it has accomplished exactly what Elena dreamed about when she wrote in her journal about the healing power of unconditional love. Leave a comment below and tell me about someone who learned from your kindness, your patience, your refusal to give up on difficult situations. Share this story with another woman who needs to hear that her invisible labor and quiet devotion are forms of heroism that deserve recognition. Like and subscribe so these stories of transformation can reach other hearts that are hungry for hope, other families that are waiting for the healing that only love can provide. For more stories that honor the dignity of those who serve and the power of love to overcome every obstacle, click the link to our podcast where emotional journeys like Nathan's, Marcus's, and Rose's remind us all that the greatest wealth is found not in what we accumulate, but in how deeply we allow ourselves to care for each other. Thank you for walking this path of the heart with us. Until our next story, remember that your love makes a difference, your presence matters, and your story is worthy of being told with all the respect and honor that belongs to every person who chooses healing over hiding, connection over self-protection, and hope over despair.